Good afternoon. Today I would like to talk about East India Company's trade in India. Firstly, in this video, the sequence of events that I'm going to trace out is going to be like this. Firstly, the East India Company gets a right to trade in a vaguely defined region called the East Indies from the Queen Elizabeth. Its main objective was to trade at a place called Spice Islands east of Indonesia and then make profits out of it. I will talk about the voyage to the East Indies or Indonesia. And then I will also talk about what prompted the East India Company to look towards India. If they wanted to trade in spices in east of Indonesia, what prompted them to look towards India? And then after deciding to shift their operations to India, how difficult was it to get a trade privilege, to get certain privileges, to get certain comforts to trade in India? So basically it was the time of the Mughal Emperor Jahangir when the East India Company for the first time set their or an official of East India Company had set his foot on the Indian soil, and then they would want some trade privileges. And I will also talk about why the East India Company could not attack India to take control over the trade in that region, in the Indian region. It rather resorted to diplomacy rather than attacking. I will talk about that, and then I'll talk about the difficulties that the East India Company had to get those trade privileges after carrying out the diplomacy. So these are the sequence of events that I'm going to trace out in this video. So firstly, let's directly get into the first part. In the first part, the East India Company has formed and it gets a right from the Queen Elizabeth I of England to trade in a very vaguely defined region called the East Indies. So East Indies was a region between the Cape of Good Hope at the tip of South Africa and another region which would connect the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean called the Strait of Magellan south of South America. What does it mean to say that they got a right to trade? What that meant is they had the monopoly. They had the monopoly to trade in that region for 15 years. And what that meant was no other company had any right to trade in that region from England. Not only that, they also had the right to carry out the 6 voyages without paying custom duties in England. And then the third thing is they had a right to acquire territory and also to govern that territory and also to maintain a private army while carrying out that trade. So basically they had all these privileges given by Queen Elizabeth, and this they got on 31st December 1600. And right away after getting this rights, or you can call it the license, or you could call it a charter, they would make a number of voyages to the region called Spice Islands east of Indonesia, where a lot of spices like cloves and cinnamon and nutmeg and mace, some of them are native and popular, were grown in that region. And those Spice Islands were called Moluccas. The region east of Indonesia were called Moluccas. So they wanted to go there and then have a monopoly of trade over there and then make profits after getting those spices. So they would make a number of voyages, and in this video I will talk about the first voyage. So firstly they'll make their first voyage on 13th February 1601. So after getting their charter on 31st December, they would right away make the voyage. And this would happen with a fleet of 4 ships, and the head ship, or the ship that headed these remaining 3 ships out of the 4, was called the Red Dragon. And then they would make a travel. They would go to a region in Indonesia, to a place called Aceh, and there they would negotiate with the Sultan of that region to trade in spices. Not only that, after the negotiation, after getting out some spices, they would also find a large merchant ship, a Portuguese merchant ship called a carrack, and they would the crew members would spy on that merchant ship, and then they would loot the spices from there as well, and they would finally return back to England waters on 1602 June. So basically they start on 13th February 1601 and they come back. No, they start on 13th February 1601, they go to Aceh, reach Aceh on June 1602, and then they would get their spices, some from Aceh and some from the carrack, the Portuguese carrack, and then they would return back to English waters on 1603 June. And after reaching the south of England with all these spices, 900 tons of spices, the cloves and cinnamons and nutmeg and most importantly pepper, they would make a profit of 300%. They would make some more voyages to the Spice Islands, or rather Indonesia and then the Spice Islands, but then it was understood that it was not sustainable. It was not sustainable because the Dutch had already made their presence felt there. And why was it not sustainable? Because the Dutch had their East India Company, which was really financially well backed, and also were well armed compared to the English East India Company. Because of this, there were a number of battles that occurred between the East India Company of Britain and that of Dutch, and in majority of the battles, the East India Company would come on the defeated side. So basically, these battles were fought to get a monopoly over the trade in the region called the Moluccas, east of Indonesia, trade of the spices that are grown indigenously out there. The most popular of spices are nutmeg and maize. So nutmeg is a kind of a seed that is grown in a tree, and sometimes it's grounded to make those spices, to add them as flavor into food. And maize is a kind of it's a kind of spice that is made from the dried outer shell of the nutmeg, and once again used for flavoring food as spices. So in majority of these battles between the Dutch and the English would be defeated. For example, if I were to take you to 1623, a little bit forward, we are only in 1603 now. I'm taking you forward to 1623. There was a Dutch fleet that had attacked the trading station of the English East India Company and killed 10 officers. So basically, seeing these grim state of affairs, the East India Company decided that they would not trade much in this lucrative trade in the Spice Islands. They would rather shift their operations to a less competitive region, but still an emerging sector, a sector that consisted trade in cotton textiles, trade in indigo, trade in jewels, trade in a certain kind of shiny cotton on which there would be printed designs like flowers that would be used to make curtains and put on furniture, called chins. And the source of all these goods was India. And therefore, that was the moment in which the East India Company had looked towards India. They shifted their operations from the Moluccas, from a lucrative trade in the Moluccas, and they would look towards India. So this is the first part of the video, and then I will talk about, now from now on, I will talk about what the East India Company did after going to India. So let me go ahead. I will go ahead, jump from 1603 to 1608. On 28th August 1608, a fleet of ships from England arrive, that of East India Company, commanded by a sea captain called William Hawkins. He was the first English or the East India Company officials, English East India Company official to have set foot on India, and he would do so at a region in the west coast of India called Surat. So now I think it's apt for me to give a little bit of background about India. What was India like at that time? Let me go ahead and tell you. So India had a population of 150 million at that time, and it contributed to 1/4 of the entire world trade. That was a lot. And not only that, it was one of the global leaders in the trade in manufactured goods. And it was a time where the Mughals had reigned in India, and because of the global leader status, the Mughal monarch was the richest monarch on earth. He made an annual income of, I think, 100 million pounds per annum. And because of the global leader status, because India could make such cheap manufactured goods, a country in North America called Mexico, in central Mexico, or rather the Mexico would go through deindustrialization because of the import of cheap cotton textiles from India. So this was the status of India way back in 1608, when the East India Company, when the official of the East India Company called William Hawkins had set his foot on India for the first time. Now let us compare this with what it was, or the situation of England. England at that time was coming out of a impoverished agricultural economy, and unlike India, it had only contributed to around 3% to the world manufacturing, or the 3% of the trade in manufactured goods. Whatever profits it has actually made from this trade, the majority of this profit would go to the coffers of the Mughal emperor at Agra. Let me give you some evidence to give you a flavor of what that meant. So between 1586 and 1605, there was 18 metric tons of English silver that flowed onto the Mughal territories. And it was the time when a Mughal emperor called Akbar had reigned. So that was a lot of silver. And so basically what I want to say is Indian economy at that time was one of the richest in the world. And also a small fact to back it up is the word Mughal that is associated with business business people, probably business Mughals, is derived from the opulence of the Mughals at that time. Mughal and Mughals, and it's still in use. So this was what India was like, and now let me just come back to the story. William Hawkins is in Surat on 28th February 1608, and did the East India Company have an option to attack India? Not at all, because the Mughal army had a strength of 400,000, but not only that, it was a very powerful army. It was a very strong army. Let me again give you a flavor of what that meant, and now I have to take you to 1602 a little bit forward, and I'll come back to 1603 soon, 1608 soon. So what happened in 1602 that proves that the Mughal army was strong and the East India Company could not have attacked India to get control of trade. Rather, they had to resort to diplomacy. So in 1603, it was the Mughal emperor called Shah Jahan was ruling India and majority of India. And there were these foreigners, Portuguese, who had their settlement in West Bengal at a region called Hooghly. And here they would make certain illegal fortifications. They would also make some luxurious homes for themselves, and this was against the rules. Not only that, they would also flaunt other rules, like they would carry out some forcible conversions to Christianity in that region. So having known Shah Jahan, having known that the Portuguese were doing something illegal, he had instructed his troops to go and expel the Portuguese out of that region and take control of that region. The troops found it very easy to do that, and some of the Portuguese would escape. They would be expelled, and the Mughal troops would take control of Hooghly. And some of the Portuguese would also try to escape through the Ganges River, and the Mughal troops would capture them as well and take them to the emperor in Agra to beg for the mercy of the emperor. And so some of those people, there were some 400 Portuguese who tried to escape through the Ganges, and some of these Portuguese had begged mercy to the emperor, but there were some who did not, and they were taken as prisoners or slaves, and majority of them died. While all this was happening, there was this Mughal governor in Goa. He just could not do anything. So this tells a lot about what would happen if the East India Company would attack the Mughals. Even in 1608, they were very strong. They had a very strong army and a large army. They could not do that, unlike the trend set by many of the other European countries, the Dutch and the Spanish. Let me tell you what the Dutch and the Spanish did. So the Spanish, way back in 1520s, to get control of the trade in central Mexico, they attacked the Aztec Empire, and they killed a lot of people, massacred them, got control. The Dutch in the Spice Islands, which I mentioned before, also massacred the inhabitants and seized the ports to take control of the trade in spices. For example, there was a time when some 800 inhabitants of an island in the Moluccas called the Lontur were actually deported to another island also near Indonesia called Java, so that they could work in the new spice plantations in the region. So the Dutch and the Spanish attacked, but the English cannot attack. And you have seen what would happen, what would possibly happen if they would have attacked. So they took a wise option not to attack. They took a wise option to uh, to to carry out diplomacy, to get some trade privileges at least, to get a piece of land, so that they could build a trading station or a factory where they could store goods. They could do that in Surat, and they could carry out their trade peacefully and under the protection of the Mughal emperor. So, in an effort to carry out diplomacy, William Hawkins would travel to Agra. It would take him 1 year. So he had set foot on 1608, and now he had traveled to Agra. He had traveled to Agra dressed as an Afghan nobleman. He would get an opportunity to meet the emperor. The emperor was Jahangir at that time. But Jahangir was not too impressed with this nobleman. He would not give him much time. And William Hawkins would also make it a point to converse in Turkish, because the founder of the Mughals had his mother tongue as Turkish, so Jahangir was quite good with Turkish. But all this did not make an impression on Jahangir. He would not give him much time, and ultimately no trade privileges were given for East India Company after this first attempt. This first attempt failed. So William Hawkins would return back after staying until 1611. He came on 1608, staying until 1611, and he would be gifted an Armenian wife or an Armenian woman, and he would return back without any trade privileges. Now the East India Company resorted to other tactics. What did they do to get the trade privileges? Let me go ahead and tell you. And so East India Company back in England would persuade the King of England. Now it is the King of England. The charter was given by the Queen Elizabeth in 1600. Now a king has ascended the throne. And the name of this king was King James, and he would be persuaded by the company to send a royal envoy to the Mughal court. He would send an envoy, and the head of the envoy is a diplomat, a courtier, and an MP. There was a parliament at that time as well, despite the monarchy. Yes. And this person, the diplomat, the courtier, the MP, he was called Sir Thomas Roe. And Sir Thomas Roe, with his royal envoy, would reach the palace of Jahangir, this time in Ajmer, not in Agra, this time in Rajasthan, west of India, not in Uttar Pradesh. And he would go with a number of gifts for the emperor. Some of them most important of them were the crates of red wine. He knew that emperor was fond of red wine. And there were also other gifts like the hunting dogs, British breed of hunting dogs called English Mastiffs and Irish Greyhounds. There was also a coach that could be driven by a horse, an English coach that was taken, and also some miniature paintings and other gifts. So ultimately the aim of Sir Thomas Roe was to get some trading privileges, to trade peacefully under the protection of the Mughal emperor, get a piece of land in Surat to set up their trading stations. And Sir Thomas Roe would ultimately want to, as soon as he reached the palace, would immediately touch the topic of the trade privileges, but Jahangir was not too interested regarding the stuff of trade and commerce. He would rather put such workday matters to some other time. He was more interested in the country of Thomas Roe. He was more interested in what England was like. So whenever the topic of trade privileges would be touched by Thomas Roe, he would divert the topic and he would say something like, "How was England?" So I will talk about those conversations now, immediately. So Jahangir would be interested about what England was like and what would they find there, and Thomas Roe would talk about, would say that England would have has a lot of curiosities, lot of rarities, lot of precious items, and if Jahangir had granted the trade privileges, the King James would actually present those precious items to Jahangir. So this is what Thomas Roe would reply to Jahangir. And Jahangir, in response, would ask whether those precious items were jewels or precious stones. And Sir Thomas Roe would reply, "Such items of rarity are found even in India. There were other precious items that King James would send, and mind you, there are a lot of merchants that come to England," he would say that, and to collect their rarities, to collect their curiosities, to collect their precious items. So Jahangir then said that he wouldn't really respond much to the issue of trade sanctions. There is no evidence for that as far as I've seen. But he said that he desired an English horse. And he was also interested in other things, like are there some rare pieces of art in England, and also about beer, because beer would not be made in the Mughal territory. He was interested in knowing how often Thomas Roe drank, and how many times he drank, and was it possible to make beer in the Mughal territories, in the Mughal palace. So this was the nature of conversation that would happen, and it had nothing to do with trade privileges, despite the urgency that Thomas Roe felt at asking for these trade privileges. There were also other conversations. There were conversations about the miniature painting. I talked about a miniature paintings that Thomas Roe had bought as gifts. And there was a small story there was a small event related to this. Thomas Roe would show one of the paintings drawn by one of his girlfriends, and show it to Jahangir, and Jahangir would immediately get this painting, a replica of this painting done by his artist, and then show it back to Thomas Roe and ask him whether he could make any difference, and he would say he couldn't make any difference, not Thomas Roe. He would tell Thomas Roe that Jahangir that Thomas Roe could not make any difference between the duplicate miniature and the original miniature. So ultimately Jahangir was kind of bragging about the abilities of his artists, or likely bragging about it. So I would like to give you one more event that occurred between Sir Thomas Roe and Jahangir, and it has got to do with the English coach that Sir Thomas Roe had gifted Jahangir. Jahangir would get another English coach made in his Mughal workshops. They were called karkhanas, so that it could be of use to his wife, Jahangir's wife, Nur Jahan. And on the original coach, he would get that decorated, he would get the interiors decorated by a Mughal cloth of gold, once again displaying the opulence of the Mughals. So despite all these conversations which carried on for months, the Mughals would not pay much attention to the English. There is a lot of evidence to show this. So immediately after Sir Thomas Roe came to the palace of Jahangir, he had certain complaints regarding the accommodations that was given to his embassy. So Sir Thomas Roe would say that they were only given just 4 small rooms, and they could be easily filled by just 2 cartloads of goods. They were so small, and there would not be any light that would be inside the rooms. There was just one door. What he meant was there were no windows in the rooms. He would make such complaints about the accommodation given by the Mughals to the English. Not only that, Sir Thomas Roe would also be humiliated by seeing that the Portuguese were actually gifting the emperor, had brought with them certain gifts like jewels and pearls, and Thomas Roe would be humiliated because of after thinking about the English goods, which were far less expensive. So if this is an evidence of how the Mughals treated the British or the English, there is also another glaring evidence to show the treatment or the relationship between the English and the Mughals, and this has got to do with a miniature painting that was drawn by a court artist called Bichitra. So in this miniature painting, so the central person was Jahangir, and King James, the King of England, was placed below the feet of Jahangir. He was standing, and in the hierarchy there were a number of people. There were 4 people below Jahangir, and in that hierarchy, King James would be third in that position. And not only that, he would be below the feet of the emperor. And the way it is portrayed also talks a little bit about the mindset of the Mughals. I'll tell you how it's portrayed. It was not only was he just standing below the feet of the emperor, the King James, but also the feelings that are conveyed in his face were quite different. Firstly, he would wear a certain kind of a hat that consisted of jewels, and then a silver jacket he would wear, and it was called a goblet. But the feeling in his face was a feeling of annoyance, an annoyance related to the lowly position in the Mughal hierarchy. Once again, this shows how the Mughals have had the kind of relationship that the Mughals had with the English. They really did not, it seems that they really did not pay much attention to the English at that time. Not only that, there's one more evidence. Jahangir had a habit of writing voluminous diaries, and not in one of these diaries would he mention the name of Sir Thomas Roe. Another piece of glaring evidence to show the relationship between the Mughals and the English. So, nevertheless, gradually and slowly, the English also would find ways to get imperial favors from the Mughals and get ahead of the other foreigners like the French, the Dutch, and the Portuguese. And the English would have to get used to the etiquette, the court etiquette of the Mughals. They had to speak Persian, the court language of the Mughals, and they had to get used to a lot of things like this. And ultimately, after 3 years of stay of Sir Thomas Roe, they would get some privileges. Not many, some privileges. And these privileges were a piece of land to build their trading stations or factories to store their trading items in Surat, and also some passes that had imperial orders which the English could show to the Mughal officials and carry out a hassle-free trade under the protection of the emperor. So and these were not many privileges, and it would take another century before the Mughals had actually paid attention to the British. So initially the British had to bend to the will of the Mughal emperor to really get the privileges they wanted. They could not attack the Mughal emperor or the empire. So that is the end of it, end of this video. I hope you got to understand how the East India Company, why the East India Company had looked towards India in the first place, and after looking towards India, why is it that they could not think of attacking India, and after resorting to an option of diplomacy, how long it took for the East India Company, or rather the British, and through that the East India Company, to get the trading privileges. And you could also see that there were not many trading privileges. I hope you were able to get a lot of things that I said in this video. So thank you very much.